Magical Encounters Between Spain and Mexico by Meg Lynn and Liz Reese. In this video, we will discuss magical encounters between Spain and Mexico, focusing on cultural exchanges and the role of religion during Spain's first recorded contacts with the New World. While we all know that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, Hernan Cortez's interaction with and near decimation of the Aztecs tells a slightly different story. Also a Spanish conquistador, Cortez was set to command his own expedition to Mexico in 1519, but was called back by Diego Velázquez. Instead, Cortez ignored the order and continued on to Mexico to find Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztecs. But first, before we tell you the whole story, here's some background. Before the Spanish conquest, the Aztec Empire was largely run by men. Most of the deities the Aztecs worshipped were men, apart from a handful of female deities. Sure, women could hold retail administrator positions in the marketplace, but that was also controlled by their husbands or fathers if the women were single. Men even controlled child rearing. Husbands would raise sons and wives would raise their daughters. Each of the genders would be taught separate tasks from the other in order to fill their roles in society. Men also ruled the kingdom. The empire was made up of city-states called Altepto. Each of the states was ruled by a supreme leader, or Tlatoni, and a supreme judge or administrator called Chicotl. The emperors or supreme leaders of the state were selected by a committee of nobles. In order to be a leader, an individual must have had a relative that was a former supreme leader. These leaders owned all of the land inside the state lines and were the individuals receiving tribute, which was a part of Aztec life. Tribute was an obligation citizens had while living in the empire. Items of tribute included food, warrior equipment, and animal products. Citizens were also expected to pay taxes in order to support the empire. In the Aztec Empire, you were either a noble, meaning priest, military, or government member, or a commoner. Commoners could be farmers, artisans, or merchants. Commoners would sell their goods in marketplaces. The capital, Tenochtitlan, had a market every day, while other cities would have periodic markets. These cities would hold market every 5th, 9th, 13th, or 20th day. The Aztecs even had business contracts. These contracts were verbal and legalized by 4 other people. They were used in all aspects of business, from sales to employment to loan contracts. Another important thing to note is that the Aztecs did not really have a fortified standing army. And when I say fortified, I mean they didn't have steel. The weapons were made of wood. Much of the empire was politically controlled by the emperor and supreme leaders. Just before the Spanish conquest, civil discontent in the Aztec Empire was on the rise. Moctezuma, the emperor at the time, had increased taxes and the demand for human sacrifice. Tenochtitlan had more than 140,000 inhabitants at its height and was the most densely populated city to ever exist in Mesoamerica. The leader Moctezuma thought Cortez was the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, who was prophesied to have white skin and to return that year in the Aztec calendar to cause the end of the world. Unsure of how to treat him, Moctezuma gave Cortez valuable gifts of gold and silver, among others. Shortly after arriving in Tenochtitlan, Cortez was gifted an Aztec woman as a chief advisor. She was known as La Malinche. In her early life, she was banished by her mother, who faked her own daughter's death by holding a fake funeral. In reality, her mother actually gave her to traders who sold her to the leader of another state. This leader of the state gave La Malinche to Hernan Cortez originally as a domestic servant. Eventually, La Malinche developed a relationship with Cortez and became his chief advisor and primary translator during the Spanish conquest. She even advised him during battle and had a child with him named Martin. In May of 1520, while Cortez was gone, the Spanish massacred a group of nobles in Tenochtitlan. This created an uprising of the Aztec people, which drove the Spanish out of town. The Aztecs felt confident that they were through the threat of the Spanish, but then smallpox, introduced by the Europeans, ripped through the population, killing almost a quarter of the Aztec people. Shortly after this, Cortez began a campaign to conquer the Aztec Empire. Cortez was successful in gaining control over half of the Aztec lands. In 1521, Cortez laid siege on Tenochtitlan, cutting off all supplies. The Aztecs surrendered after 3 months of destruction. The Spanish then built another city using the ruins of Tenochtitlan and established control over the empire. Conquistadors became rulers of former Aztec towns and were tasked with making sure the indigenous people converted to Christianity. The conquistadors were in charge of protecting the indigenous, but still required the indigenous to pay tribute and provide services. In 1522, Cortez began to introduce domestic animals from Europe and continued to implement the European way of life, by which the indigenous people were expected to live. The Aztecs were polytheistic, worshiping gods of war, rain, and sun, among others. Spanish priests assumed the Aztecs' religious practices required a pact with the devil, who appeared in their visions. Male and female diviners also determined the causes of illness or misfortune, found lost objects or people, and forecasted the future. They gazed into water, cast maize grains or crystals, and analyzed the resulting pattern, knotted and unknotted cords, measured the client's arm with their palm, or felt their client's pulse. The Aztecs offered human sacrifices to please the sun god, so that he could continue providing them with light, warmth, and life. They believed that without human sacrifice, the sun would stop and everything would die. Heart extraction was the most common technique, and some human flesh was consumed. The flesh was cut to offer blood to the gods. Eliminating these sacrificial rituals and the worship of idols was the Spanish evangelizers' foremost concern. Even if indigenous people accepted the identification of their deities and magical practices with the devil, in the absence of moral dualism, they would not necessarily reject them for that reason. Mesoamerican cosmology balanced creation against destruction and chaos against order. All superhuman entities required respect and service, and the devil could have his uses just as God and the saints did. The Aztecs came to associate the devil with states of disorder, drunkenness, violence, sexual tensions, and jealousy, and the destructive emotions associated with these conditions. The idea that the Aztecs were enthralled to the devil and if freed might easily fall back into his service colored the Spaniards' views of all native religious practices. Magic and witchcraft were lesser concerns for them than adulterous sacrifice was. However, because Europeans associated the Aztecs with the devil, they too violated the First Amendment. Despite this, the colony's shortage of licensed medical specialists, be they physicians, surgeons, or even bloodletting barbers, made it impossible for the Spaniards to suppress indigenous practitioners. Aztec healers, who were also magicians, did not deter sick people. Many non-indigenous clients sought to improve their health, economic opportunities, or social lives by magical means, and they sought out those best equipped to provide such assistance, paying for their services and not caring in times of crisis if the Aztecs' powers came from the devil. Mexico remains a place where magic is an everyday thing, from the charms and powders sold in any of its markets, to the virgins and Christs who appear on subway tiles or scorched tortillas. Shamans and other traditional specialists still practice their arts. The magical marketplace has a global reach. A Nahua healer travels annually to Manhattan to ritually cleanse her wealthy clients, and tourists seek shaman-guided spiritual experiences at Mesoamerican ruins. We hope you enjoyed this presentation by Meg and Liz.